When more than one person is buying property in Ontario, there's a legal ownership decision that has to be made on title: joint tenants or tenants in common. As you're watching this, keep one question in mind. Do you want ownership to stay together, or do you want it to stay separate? My name is Zachary Soccio-Marandola. I'm a real estate lawyer here in Toronto, and I help people like you close real estate deals every single day. Now, today we're going to walk through what joint tenants means, what tenants in common means, and how to choose the right one for your situation. If there's only one owner, none of this applies. But the moment there are two or more owners, Ontario Land Titles requires that ownership be structured one of two ways: joint tenants or tenants in common. Let's start with joint tenants. Joint tenants means all owners hold the property together as a single ownership interest. So each owner has an equal interest, the same rights, and no distinct share that can be separated. The defining legal feature is the right of survivorship. So to be clear, if one joint tenant dies, their interest does not pass through the estate. It automatically goes to the surviving owner or owners equally. The transfer happens by operation of law, not by will. This ownership structure is most commonly used by spouses, since most of the time their wills leave property to each other anyways, and this way they avoid the probate process and the fees. Now, a procedural point that matters in real estate transactions: when a joint tenant dies, the surviving owner still needs to take a small step if they're planning on doing anything with the property. So for example, if they're selling the property, refinancing, or registering a new mortgage, the change still has to be reflected on title. That's done by registering a survivorship application. This removes the deceased owner's name from legal title. So to be clear, the ownership transfer happens by law, but the land registry still requires a formal application to update title. This is purely administrative. Now let's contrast that with tenants in common. Tenants in common means that each owner holds a separate ownership interest in the property. Those interests can be equal or unequal. It could be 50-50, it could be 75-25, even 99-1. They're legally distinct ownership interests, and they can be dealt with independently. In contrast to joint tenancy, the structure is commonly used by unrelated parties. So think friends, siblings, business partners, or investors. It's also used when a parent is required to be on title with a child for financing purposes. In those cases, tenants in common allows ownership to be structured to reflect the intent, often a 99% and 1% split. This will satisfy the lender's requirements that the parent be on title, while still documenting where the primary ownership is intended. But remember, the percentages on title have real legal consequences. They should align with the broader transaction and any related agreements. Every legal title owner, even with 1%, needs to sign off if there's a sale. With tenants in common, there is no right of survivorship. If one tenant in common dies, their ownership interest does not automatically transfer to the other owner. It forms part of their estate and is dealt with through either their will or under intestacy rules. Because each owner's interest is separate, tenants in common arrangements often work best when paired with a co-ownership agreement. Now, a co-ownership agreement is a private contract between the owners that sets out how the ownership works in practice. Things like how expenses are shared, what happens if someone wants to sell, how disputes are resolved. But remember, the land registry only records legal ownership, not the day-to-day rules between co-owners. That's what this agreement is for. Here's how to think about choosing the right ownership structure for your situation. At this point, you should pause and ask yourself a question. Do you want ownership to move automatically if something happens to one of the owners, or do you want each owner's share to stay clearly defined and separate, even if that means additional steps later? If your priority is simplicity and continuity, where ownership stays together and transfers automatically, then joint tenancy usually aligns with that goal, especially in family situations. Now, if your priority is control, where each owner's interest is clearly defined and dealt with separately, tenants in common will usually make more sense. That instinctive answer is important, because the law will follow the structure on title. Now let's put that into a real transactional context. Let's say an agreement of purchase and sale is signed, the closing date is set, and then before closing, one owner dies. If the property is owned as tenants in common, probate will almost always be required before the transaction can proceed. In practical terms, that usually makes it impossible to meet the original closing date. If the property is owned as joint tenants, the transaction can often still close in time. Once a survivorship application is registered to remove the deceased owner from title, the surviving owner can continue with the sale. So same property, same agreement, different ownership structure, and a very different outcome. Joint tenancy and tenants in common are intentional legal selections made on closing. The practical takeaway is this: the right choice should be discussed before closing, and that's usually done with your real estate lawyer. Changing it later is possible, but it's not automatic. You often need consent, and it's not free. One last point people often miss: joint tenancy is not permanent. That means any joint tenant can unilaterally sever the joint tenancy during their lifetime without the consent of the other owner or owners. Once severed, the ownership automatically converts into a tenants in common situation, and the right of survivorship is eliminated. But remember, severance has to be done properly and reflected on title. Intent alone is not enough. So if you remember one thing from all of this, joint tenants means survivorship, tenants in common means separate ownership. If you understand that distinction, you're already ahead of most buyers. Now, if you're enjoying these behind the scenes real estate law videos, be sure to subscribe to the channel. I post a new video every week. And if you're in the industry, I also send a weekly newsletter with practical legal info written specifically for realtors. The link is below in the description. Thanks for watching.